So the previous slide lists all the characteristics that all living things share. But what we're going to go through now is a series of slides that represents some of those characteristics individually. This one represents that all living things are composed of cells, which is a big idea in biology, that cells are the basic unit of structure and function. So that right there is the big idea. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in living things. So there are unicellular organisms and multicellular organisms. Unicellular are made up of just one cell, one. And multicellular are made up of thousands to trillions of cells, like you. Your body is made up of trillions of cells. Generally, unicellular organisms are microscopic. You need a microscope to see them. That's not 100% true. There are some unicellular organisms that are so large you can see them with the naked eye. Likewise, multicellular organisms are generally macroscopic. You can see them with the naked eye. But there are some that are so small that they're microscopic. So there are exceptions to both those rules. The top row of the pictures that I put on this slide represent the three kingdoms that are multicellular. So in general, these three kingdoms are multicellular. The bottom row represents the kingdoms that are unicellular. And all six kingdoms are represented here. So if we label them, we've got Kingdom Animalia, and there is no exception to the rule that Kingdom Animalia is 100% multicellular. There's no such thing as a unicellular animal. Likewise with Kingdom Plantae. There's no such thing as a unicellular plant. The characteristics that define Kingdom Animalia and Kingdom Plantae is that they are multicellular. They are all multicellular. Kingdom Fungi, on the other hand, has an exception, and we'll come back to that. Kingdom Protista in general are unicellular organisms, but there is an exception. Some of the algae are considered multicellular. So Protista is generally unicellular, but there are some multicellular algae. Kingdom Fungi, as I mentioned, has an exception in that most fungi are multicellular, but there are some unicellular fungi, and that's what we refer to as yeast. So yeast are unicellular fungi. But most fungi are multicellular, like this toadstool is made up of many cells. Finally, we've got the Kingdom Archaebacteria and Kingdom Eubacteria, which are both bacterial kingdoms, and they are a different kind of cell than the other cells that make up the other four kingdoms. They're prokaryotic cells, which means they don't have a nucleus, and they are all unicellular. So just like there's no such thing as a unicellular animal or a unicellular plant, there's no such thing as a multicellular bacteria. They can live in colonies, but they're considered individual cells, unicellular. This slide represents that all living things contain DNA and use the same genetic code. So the figure on the left that's animated here is showing DNA replication. DNA is double-stranded, and you may have also heard it described as a double helix, which means it's twisted, like a twisted ladder. Here it's untwisted, so it looks more like a ladder. And these are nucleotides that are being added. One at a time, nucleotides are added to an open strand of DNA to make the second strand. That's the double, two strands, double helix in double helix. But again, every living thing has DNA. That's a characteristic of all life. And some viruses have DNA, but then other viruses have RNA. DNA is in every living cell, the basis for what we call the central dogma of biology. You have to say it like that, central dogma of biology, which starts with DNA, and we'll get into that in more detail later. But DNA codes for proteins, and proteins being made from DNA, from the information stored in DNA, is really the central dogma of biology. So DNA stores and replicates genetic information. In other words, genes. Genetic information, genes. And it makes that information available during gene expression, what we call gene expression. And again, that's part of that central dogma of biology. When genes are expressed, proteins are made. That's, in a nutshell, the central dogma of biology. And then proteins do everything else that keep a living thing alive. And DNA functions in heredity because it's passed from parents to offspring. Whether that be a unicellular organism just dividing in two, the two new cells get a copy of the DNA from the parent cell, or whether it be sexual reproduction and two parents that are shuffling their genes together to make a new individual, the genes that are being shuffled are copies of the parents' genes. So that's all the idea of heredity, passing on genetic information from parents to offspring. So the circular table here is the genetic code, and we don't need to get into the details of how it works. You may already be somewhat familiar with it or seen more of a square table or rectangular table that shows the genetic code too. But in general, there are codons that code for amino acids. So what are all around the outside are amino acids. And a codon is like a three-letter word. So, for example, CAG codes for glutamine, the amino acid glutamine. And that's pretty much how the genetic code works in every living thing on the planet. There's some strange exceptions where there are certain codons that only certain bacterial species have, for example, that other living things don't have. Same with amino acids. There are certain amino acids that can be found in obscure bacterial species. But for the most part, we all use the same genetic code and we all use the same amino acids, which suggests something. We all have DNA, we all use the same genetic code, which suggests that we all come from the same origin, that we're all related. And when I say we all, I don't mean just us humans, I mean every living thing on the planet. This slide represents that all living things reproduce, and we're looking at the two forms of reproduction here. In general, there's sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. On the left is representing sexual reproduction, where a sperm cell is fertilizing an egg cell. And that's, in general, the idea when it comes to sexual reproduction. There are two parents and genetic information from two parents that are being combined and shuffled together to make a new individual, a unique offspring. The hydra here, which is a cnidarian, a relative of jellyfish and anemones and corals, is undergoing budding. So this is a new individual that is growing off of this parent individual, and that new individual, that offspring, is genetically identical to the parent. It's a clone of the parent, and identical in every way, genetically identical. And that's an example of asexual reproduction. And there are other forms of asexual reproduction. This is just one form of asexual reproduction, and we'll be looking at that later. Right now, you just need to understand that there is both sexual and asexual reproduction, and you need to understand the benefits and the drawbacks of each. So, when it comes to asexual reproduction, it's more efficient. Budding, for example, can produce a lot more offspring in a lot shorter period of time, and there's no energy expended by the parent to find a mate. There is no need for a mate. One parent can have offspring. So it's much more efficient. The problem is, and this is the drawback, there's no variation in the offspring. Well, what's the big deal about that? Well, when we consider sexual reproduction, it's less efficient and more energy in terms of energy and time, but it introduces variation in the offspring. And variation is extremely important when it comes to evolution, because variation, and you're going to hear me say this over and over and over all year long, variation is the raw material of natural selection and evolution. Variation is what natural selection selects from in order to cause species to change over time. And that's evolution. This slide represents that all living things grow and develop. And if it's a multicellular organism, well, this figure represents a multicellular organism. So this is how you grew and developed. From one cell that was the zygote. When your father's sperm fertilized your mother's egg, you started out as a zygote. which was one cell. And that one cell then, and so you, at one point, you were a unicellular organism, and then you started to divide and became 2 cells and 4 cells and 8 cells. And in the diagram, that's what we're seeing here, an 8-cell embryo. And that continues until there are numerous cells. And what this diagram is showing is that some of these cells, very early in embryonic development, are what we call pluripotent. Pluripotent meaning that they can turn into any one of the over 200 different specialized cell types in the human body. That's the power of these cells known as stem cells. So theoretically, with these stem cells, we can create any tissue in the human body, any cells and build any tissue to replace damaged tissue in the human body. But this is an example. Well, you grow by adding more cells. You grow through cell division, and you develop by those cells as they divide, as you were developing as an embryo and a fetus, and then finally a baby that was born. The cells, as they divided, differentiate and become specialized. So they become, differentiation simply means they become different from each other. And as they become different from each other, what they're going in the direction of becoming specialized to perform special functions, like we see in the diagram here. We've got blood cells and cardiac muscle cells, which is heart muscle, and nerve cells, and they all look very different. They have very different structures because they're carrying out very different functions. And again, cells are the basic unit of structure and function, and we can see that very clearly here. These different cells look very different from each other because they're carrying out very different functions. And like I pointed out, there are over 200 different specialized cell types in the human body. This slide represents that all living things obtain and use energy to organize themselves into organisms, and that's why we call living things organisms. The top figure here represents metabolism. So in other words, you eat food, and you break down that food into the building blocks that make it up. You also get energy from that food. Then you use the energy from the food to put the building blocks from the food back together again into your cells and tissues. So that old saying, you are what you eat, is literally true. You take apart what you eat and put it back together again into your body, into your cells and tissues. The photo of the Earth here represents, so this requires a lot of interaction with the surrounding environment, and that's what ecology is all about. And so these are ecological concepts represented by the photos down here at the bottom of the slide. So the Earth photo of the Earth here is representing the biosphere. In other words, just like there's an atmosphere, all the gases around the Earth, a hydrosphere, all the water around the Earth, a lithosphere, all the land, solid part of the Earth, that's the lithosphere. There's a biosphere, which represents all life around the Earth, and that goes from deep in the ocean and deep underground to high in the atmosphere. You can find living things. So every living thing on the planet is the biosphere. The left diagram represents what happens to energy in the biosphere, and it's very simply represented here by what you probably recognize as a food chain. So this is a food chain. Food webs represent the same thing. The arrows represent energy being transferred from one level of the food chain to the next. So it starts with the sun. The energy comes from the sun. That's captured by photosynthetic organisms, producers. The producers are eaten by primary consumers, and then primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers, and so forth. Notice that there is no arrow here. So even though this is drawn as a circular diagram, it's not representing a cycle. Most of the time, cycles are shown as circular diagrams. And this is actually better represented in a linear diagram because there is no connection here between the wolf and the sun. In other words, the energy doesn't go from the Earth, or I'm sorry, from the wolf back to the sun. So what you need to remember here is that energy flows. It flows in one direction from the sun through the producers to the consumers, and it's eventually dissipated as heat. It's lost as heat. Likewise, this diagram represents one of the cycles that we call a biogeochemical cycle, so specifically the carbon cycle. So it's how carbon cycles through both the living and non-living environment, or ecosystem, or biosphere. I should say biosphere, because it really is a whole Earth cycle. So matter doesn't flow, it cycles, right? So that's what you want to remember. That's what you want to take away here finally from this slide, is that energy flows through the biosphere and matter cycles. Matter is constantly being recycled and cycles through the biosphere. This slide also has to do with the fact that living things respond to their environment. And that's what we typically call behavior, which involves two parts, stimulus and response. And so that's kind of the idea of the cartoon here. Stimulus, response. Stimulus, response. Don't you ever think, well, that if you recognize what these are in the cartoon, they're supposed to be amoebas, which are one-celled protozoan organisms. And one cell can't really think. They just respond to stimuli. A one-celled organism is basically just responding to stimuli. In the case of these ants, however, they are multicellular organisms. They have a nervous system. They have a brain. And they're leafcutter ants. And so they need to get to leaves so they can chop up the leaves and carry them back to their nest. So these ants are able to communicate with each other through smell. And that's what we call a pheromone. Pheromones are smells, and ants communicate with each other through pheromones. So there's a pheromone that's put out that is a signal to the other ants to form this like living bridge to get to the leaf. And they just walk over each other across that bridge to get to the leaf. So that's an example of stimulus and response. This slide has to do with homeostasis, how organisms, living things, need to maintain a stable internal environment, whether they be a one-celled organism or a multicellular organism. So homeostasis, homeo means the same, and stasis means to stay. So stay the same, homeostasis. There are two examples here. The one on the left is a thermostat in a house, where the thermostat senses the temperature, and there's a set point. So you set your thermostat to maybe 75 degrees. And when it gets below that, it turns the furnace on. The furnace then produces heat and warms the house, and the temperature increases to the set point, and then that feeds back and turns the furnace off. That's an example of a negative feedback control system. This diagram represents how blood sugar is controlled in the human body, and it's between these two hormones produced by the pancreas, insulin and glucagon. You've probably heard of insulin before. You're more likely to have heard of insulin, maybe not glucagon. But when your blood sugar is high, your pancreas senses that and produces insulin, which travels throughout your entire body in your bloodstream and causes your cells to take in the glucose, the blood sugar that's in your blood. And that brings your blood sugar back down again. So that's an example of how your body maintains a stable blood sugar concentration in your blood. So negative feedback, the best way to understand negative feedback would be the heating system here, where again, the heater's turned on and that warms the room, but that heat eventually feeds back and turns off the heater, right? That's negative feedback, where the product of the series of reactions here eventually feeds back to turn off what is producing the product. So the product turns itself off. That's negative feedback. There are instances of positive feedback, but very rare examples. One example is childbirth. There's a hormonal feedback system that causes uterine contractions that eventually expels the baby from through the birth canal. But most of the time, positive feedback is kind of dangerous, so it's not used in living systems. This slide represents that all living things evolve. And what we're looking at here is a phylogenetic tree of bears and their relatives. A phylogenetic tree shows evolutionary relationships between species or groups of species. So we can see here that the brown bear is more closely related to a polar bear than it is to an American black bear. So the way, branches that are closer together or come together represent common ancestry. So there's a common ancestor here between the red panda and the raccoon. And there's common ancestry between all these species. If we go back farther in the tree, we can find a common branch that gives rise to all of them. So the idea here is that all living species change over time. All living things change over time or evolve because they have to, because the earth changes over time. When life first appeared on the earth was much different than it is now. And as the earth has changed, life has evolved to adapt to the changing earth. Life has to evolve in order to survive. This also represents the unity and diversity of life, which is a big idea in biology that's actually on the next slide. Because all this diversity came from common ancestry. So the common ancestry is the unity, the idea of unity, that we're all related to each other. All life on the planet is related to each other. But we have this vast diversity of millions and probably billions of species that have resulted from 4 billion years of evolution.